The letter from her dead husband arrived 3 years after they buried him, and Theresa Vaughn dropped it twice before her trembling fingers could break the seal. She stood in the doorway of her small house on the outskirts of Empire City, Colorado, watching the dust settle from the horse that had brought the postal courier. The year was 1878, and she had spent every one of those 3 years since Thomas died believing she knew everything about the man she had married. The letter suggested otherwise. Inside, she sat at the rough-hewn table and smoothed the yellowed paper. Thomas had written it before leaving for the railroad job that killed him, left it with a lawyer in Denver with instructions to deliver it if he did not return. The words swam before her eyes as she read about debts she never knew existed, about money he had borrowed from dangerous men, about promises he had made using their small ranch as collateral. When she finished reading, Theresa folded the letter carefully and pressed it between the pages of her Bible, the same place she pressed the wildflowers she collected from the meadow behind her house. The blue columbines, the Indian paintbrush, the prairie roses. Each one marked a Sunday, a prayer, a hope that tomorrow might be gentler than today. The knock came 2 days later. Theresa was hanging laundry when she heard the horses, 3 men, rough-looking with guns prominent on their hips. The leader was a thick-necked man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. He did not dismount. "You Theresa Vaughn," he called. She wiped her wet hands on her apron. "I am. Your husband owed my boss money, quite a bit of it we have come to collect." Her mouth went dry. "Thomas has been dead for 3 years. Debt does not die with the debtor, madam. We will be taking your property in settlement. This is my home, was your home. You have until the end of the month to clear out." The man touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness and turned his horse. Theresa stood among the flapping sheets and watched them ride away. The wind carried red dust across the yard, coating everything in a fine grit. She had 30 days. That evening she rode into Empire City proper. The town sat in a valley surrounded by mountains still capped with snow even in June. The mining operations had slowed in recent years, but the town persisted, stubborn as the miners who had founded it. She tied her horse outside the marshal's office. Marshal Briggs listened to her story with sympathetic eyes but shook his head. "If your husband signed papers, and it sounds like he did, there is not much law on your side. These collection men, they know how to stay just inside legal boundaries. So I lose everything." "I did not say that." He leaned back in his chair. "There is a man works cattle up in the high country, Dalton Cross. He has had dealings with these same men before, knows their methods. Might be he could offer advice." "Why would he help me?" "Dalton is not like most men. His father was a judge back east. He came out here after the war, wanted nothing more to do with cities or courts or society. But he still has a sense of justice about him, and he does not take kindly to bullies." Theresa clutched her reticule. "Where do I find him?" "He comes to town every Saturday for supplies. That is tomorrow. He will be at Garrett's General Store around noon." She spent that night on her knees beside her bed, the Bible open before her. The pressed flowers released their faint, dusty scent as she turned the pages, looking for comfort in the familiar verses. But the words blurred and her mind kept returning to the same bitter thought. Thomas had betrayed her even in death. Saturday dawned clear and bright. Theresa wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton she had made herself, and braided her dark hair in a coronet. At 24, she still had the slender build of her youth, but hard work had strengthened her hands and the sun had brought out freckles across her nose. She studied herself in the small mirror, wondering what this Dalton Cross would see when he looked at her. A woman in need. Another burden. She squared her shoulders and headed to town. Garrett's General Store smelled of coffee and leather and pickle brine. Theresa pretended to examine a display of canning jars while keeping watch on the door. Other customers came and went. She was about to give up when she heard Mr. Garrett's cheerful voice. "Dalton, right on time as always. Got your tobacco in and that book you ordered from St. Louis." Theresa turned. The man standing at the counter was tall, lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore working clothes, denim and worn leather, but there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of education and breeding. When he smiled at something Mr. Garrett said, the expression transformed his sun-weathered face. She must have made some sound because he looked directly at her. His eyes were the color of creek water, that peculiar gray-green that changed with the light. "Madam," he said, touching his hat. Theresa's carefully prepared speech evaporated. "Are you Dalton Cross?" "I am." "I need to speak with you. It is urgent." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed and catalogued. Then he nodded. "There is a cafe next door. Perhaps you would join me for coffee." They sat by the window. The owner, a stout German woman named Mrs. Hoffman, brought thick porcelain cups and a plate of butter cookies. Theresa wrapped her hands around the cup's warmth and told her story. Dalton listened without interrupting, his gaze steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for so long she feared he would refuse to help. "These men who came to see you," he finally said. "The one with the scar, did he give a name?" "Pike. He said his name was Pike." Dalton's jaw tightened. "Samuel Pike. He works for Richard Garrett." "Any relation to the store owner?" "No. Different family entirely. Richard Garrett is a businessman of the worst sort. He loans money at rates that guarantee default, then seizes property. He has been buying up land all through this valley, forcing people out." "Can anything be done, legally?" "Not much if your husband signed legitimate papers, but there are other approaches." He met her eyes. "I will look into this, Mrs. Vaughn. Where can I reach you?" She gave him directions to her ranch. He wrote them in a small leather notebook he pulled from his vest pocket. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused, but his penmanship was beautiful, flowing script that belonged in a law office, not a cattle camp. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You do not know me." Dalton set down his pencil. "My father spent 30 years on the bench, Mrs. Vaughn. He taught me that justice and law are not always the same thing. When law fails justice, good people have to step into the gap." He paused. "And I know what it is to lose everything to circumstances beyond your control." There was pain in those last words, old and deep. Theresa wanted to ask, but did not feel she had the right. They parted on the wooden sidewalk. She watched him load supplies into his wagon, moving with efficient grace. As he climbed onto the seat, he looked back at her. "I will come by your place Tuesday morning. Do not agree to anything before then." She nodded, and he drove away. Tuesday arrived wrapped in low clouds that promised afternoon rain. Theresa had been up since before dawn, cleaning her small house with anxious energy. She baked bread, swept the floors, tidied the already tidy shelves. When she caught herself arranging and rearranging the wildflowers in a jar on the table, she forced herself to sit down with her Bible. The pressed flowers were fragile between the pages. Some had been there for years, their colors faded to browns and grays. She touched the petal of a columbine carefully, and it crumbled to dust beneath her finger. Everything fades, she thought. Everything passes. She was closing the Bible when Dalton rode up. He dismounted and tied his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, to the rail. Theresa met him at the door. "Mrs. Vaughn," he greeted her. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, suddenly conscious of how small and plain her home must seem. One main room serving as kitchen and parlor, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and wardrobe, a loft where Thomas had planned to put children when they came. The children never came. Dalton removed his hat and stood just inside the door. I have been making inquiries. Your husband did sign papers with Richard Garrett. The debt is substantial, $3,000 at 20% interest compounded monthly. Theresa sank into a chair. I do not have that kind of money. I do not have any money. The original loan was for $500. Everything else is interest and fees. His voice was tight with anger. It is usury, plain and simple, but legal. Then I am lost. Not necessarily. He pulled out the small notebook. I have been tracking Garrett's dealings for 2 years now. He is careful, but not as careful as he thinks. Some of his loans were made without proper licensing. Some of his collection methods cross lines even the law in Empire City cannot ignore. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that if we can prove Garrett has broken laws in his other dealings, we might be able to force him to renegotiate your debt, or cancel it entirely in exchange for not facing prosecution. Hope fluttered in her chest. How? I need proof. Documentation. Garrett keeps records. He is meticulous about it. Those records are in a safe in his office above the Silver Crown Saloon. Dalton met her eyes. I am going to get them. You mean steal them? I mean retrieve evidence of criminal activity. That is just dressing up theft in fancy words. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. You are direct. I appreciate that. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first raindrops began to patter on the roof. Theresa stood and moved to the window, watching water stream down the glass. Why are you really doing this? She asked. The truth. Behind her, Dalton was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was low. 5 years ago, my father lost his position. A railroad company wanted land for their route. My father ruled against them based on law and precedent. They destroyed him for it. Bought witnesses, manufactured scandals, crushed him under an avalanche of lies dressed up as evidence. He died 6 months later. The railroad got their route. She turned to look at him. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see the old grief in his eyes. Men like Richard Garrett, Dalton continued, they believe money makes them untouchable. They use law as a weapon against people who cannot afford to fight back. I cannot bring my father justice, but I can try to balance the scales where I am. The rain fell harder, drumming on the roof. Theresa thought about Thomas, about the secret debts and broken promises. She thought about this stranger willing to risk himself for a woman he barely knew. She thought about pressed flowers crumbling to dust. When? She asked. Saturday night. Garrett hosts a poker game every Saturday. He will be occupied for hours. I am coming with you. Mrs. Vaughn, that is not, it is my debt, my home, my life. I am coming. Dalton studied her face. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. Very well, but you follow my lead exactly. Agreed, agreed. The week that followed passed in a strange, suspended way, each day both too fast and too slow. Theresa went through her normal routines but felt as though she were watching herself from a distance. She tended her small vegetable garden, fed the chickens, mended clothes. And she thought about Saturday night. Dalton came by twice more, ostensibly to discuss details, but really, she suspected, to make sure she had not changed her mind. On his second visit, Thursday afternoon, she offered him coffee and they sat at her table. Tell me about your flowers, he said, gesturing to the jar of fresh-cut wildflowers. What about them? You always have them. Even in winter, I would wager. She smiled despite herself. Even in winter, though those are more difficult to find. Why? Theresa traced the rim of her coffee cup. Thomas and I married young. I was 19, he was 23. My parents were dead and his family had moved back east. We had each other and not much else. Every Sunday after church, we would walk together and I would pick wildflowers. I started pressing them in my Bible to remember those walks. They must be precious to you. They were. She looked up at him. But lately I wonder if I have been holding onto the wrong things, pressing dead flowers like I can preserve the past. Maybe some things are not meant to be kept. Dalton's gaze was intense. Some things are worth preserving. The question is knowing which ones. The moment stretched between them, charged with something she could not name. Then he cleared his throat and pulled out his notebook, and they returned to planning. Saturday arrived overcast but dry. Theresa dressed in her darkest clothes, a practical split skirt and jacket. She told herself it was for ease of movement but knew she was also trying to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. Dalton arrived as the sun was setting. He had changed his usual casual manner for something harder, more focused. He checked the pistol on his hip and handed her a small crowbar. "Just in case," he said. They rode into Empire City as darkness fell. The town was alive with Saturday night energy, miners and cowboys spending their wages in the saloons and gambling halls. Music and laughter spilled from open doors. They left their horses in an alley behind the general store and approached the Silver Crown on foot. The saloon occupied a prominent corner. Garrett's office was on the second floor, windows dark. Dalton led her around to the back where an external staircase provided access to the upper level. The stairs creaked under their weight, but the noise was lost in the general clamor from below. The door to the office was locked. Dalton produced a set of picks and worked with patient skill. Theresa kept watch, her heart hammering. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked and the door swung open. Inside, the office was neat and spare. A desk, filing cabinets, a large safe against one wall. Dalton lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low, and moved to the filing cabinets. "Start with these," he whispered. "Look for loan documents, collection records, anything with signatures and dates." They worked in tense silence. Theresa's hands shook as she rifled through files. So many names, so many debts. The amounts varied, but the pattern was always the same. Small loans that ballooned into unpayable sums. "Here," Dalton said softly. He held up a ledger. "This is it. Every loan, every collection, every property seized. And look," he pointed to a column of numbers. "This is what he actually paid for properties versus what he claimed the debts were worth. The difference is staggering." A sound from below froze them both. Footsteps on the stairs. Dalton grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the desk just as the door opened. Light flooded the room. Through the narrow gap beneath the desk, Theresa saw polished boots enter. "I know someone is here," a man's voice said. "Not Pike, someone older. You might as well come out." Dalton's hand went to his gun. Theresa put her hand over his and shook her head minutely. Violence would solve nothing. She stood up. The man facing her was in his 50s, well-dressed in city clothes. He had the soft look of someone who did business from behind desks. "Richard Garrett," she presumed. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said with false courtesy. "I had a feeling you might attempt something foolish." Dalton rose beside her. "You know who I am, Dalton Cross. Of course. You have been asking questions about my business all over town. Did you think I would not notice?" Garrett smiled without warmth. "The question is what to do about you both now. Breaking and entering is a crime." "So is fraud," Dalton said. "So is extortion. So is falsifying loan documents. Prove it." "That is exactly what we intend to do." Dalton held up the ledger. "This proves it rather definitively." Garrett's composure cracked. "That is private property. Evidence of criminal activity is not protected as private property. You should know that." For a long moment, no one moved. Theresa could hear the distant sounds of the saloon, a piano playing something jaunty and out of tune. Her whole future balanced on this moment. "What do you want?" Garrett finally asked. "Mrs. Vaughn's debt canceled. All paperwork destroyed. You sign her property over free and clear. And in exchange, we do not take this ledger to the marshal. We do not telegraph the territorial attorney in Denver. We let you continue your business provided you stop the predatory lending practices. Garrett's face darkened. You are blackmailing me. I am offering you a way out of the consequences of your own actions. Take it or do not, but decide quickly, because my patience has limits. The calculation was visible on Garrett's face. Pride versus pragmatism, anger versus self-preservation. Finally, he moved to his desk and pulled out papers. The Vaughn loan, he said tersely. Where is it? Dalton pointed to a file. Garrett pulled it and with visible reluctance began tearing the documents into small pieces. Then he wrote out a new deed, transferring the property to Theresa free and clear, and signed it with sharp, angry strokes. You have made an enemy today, he said as he handed over the deed. I will survive, Dalton replied. They left quickly, taking the stairs two at a time. Only when they reached their horses did Theresa allow herself to breathe. Her legs were shaking so badly she needed help mounting. They rode out of town in silence. Once they reached open country with the lights of Empire City falling away behind them, Dalton finally spoke. You did well in there, keeping your head. I was terrified. So was I. She looked at him in surprise. You did not seem it. Years of practice. He slowed his horse. Mrs. Vaughn, I should tell you, Garrett was right about one thing. I have made an enemy. He is a vindictive man. That could spill over onto you. I am already his enemy. I was from the moment Thomas signed those papers. They reached her ranch. Dalton dismounted and helped her down. His hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, she said, for everything. I could never have done this alone. You are stronger than you know, strong enough to offer you supper. It is late, but I have stew I can warm. He hesitated, and she saw him wavering between propriety and desire. Desire won. I would like that. Inside, she lit lamps while he built up the fire. The domesticity of it felt natural, as though they had done this 100 times before. She served the stew with fresh bread and they ate at the small table. Tell me about your cattle operation, she said. Marshal Briggs said you work the high country. I have a small ranch about 15 miles north. Good grazing in the summer, sheltered valleys for winter. I run about 200 head, alone. I have 2 hands who help during roundup and branding. Otherwise, yes, alone. That must be lonely. He broke a piece of bread, not meeting her eyes. I chose it. After my father died, I wanted nothing to do with society, with people. Out here, the only judgments that matter are whether your fences are sound and your cattle are healthy. But, he looked up. But, I hear a but in your voice. Dalton smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. But lately I have been wondering if I chose solitude or simply ran away. There is a difference. I believe so. One is a positive choice. The other is just fear dressed up as independence. Theresa thought about her own life, about the 3 years she had spent alone with her pressed flowers and her grief. I understand that. They talked long into the night, conversation flowing easily. He told her about growing up in Philadelphia, about his father's courtroom, about law books and Latin lessons. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her parents' small farm, about the cholera epidemic that took them both when she was 17. Thomas was kind, she said. I want to be clear about that. He did not mistreat me, but I think maybe we married for the wrong reasons. We were both alone and frightened, and we clung to each other. That is not the same as love. What is love, then? She met his eyes across the table. I am not certain, but I think it is more than just needing someone. It is choosing them, wanting them. Not because you are afraid to be alone, but because being with them makes you more yourself. The air between them felt heavy, charged. Dalton reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused from work but gentle. "Theresa," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I should go. It is late." "Yes," she agreed, but neither of them moved. Finally, reluctantly, he released her hand and stood. She walked him to the door. Outside, the moon had risen, painting everything in silver. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "Would you like to?" "Yes," he smiled. "Then you will." He rode away into the darkness, and Theresa stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then she went inside and pulled out her Bible. The pressed flowers rustled between the pages, fragile and faded. She touched them gently, then carefully removed them one by one and laid them on the table. Some crumbled. Others held their shape, ghosts of their former beauty. She gathered them up and carried them outside, releasing them to the wind. They scattered across the dark yard, returning to the earth that made them. The next morning she picked fresh wildflowers from the meadow and put them in the jar on her table. No pressing, no preserving. Just their brief, vivid beauty while it lasted. Dalton returned 3 days later, and 3 days after that, and again the following week. Each visit lasted longer than the one before. They took to walking together in the evening, following the creek that ran through her property. She showed him the best places to find wildflowers. He taught her to identify animal tracks in the mud. "Fox," he said, pointing. "See how precise the prints are, and here deer, and these," he knelt beside the marks, "mountain lion. Old tracks, several days at least, but you should be careful when you walk out here alone." She laughed. "I have lived here for 4 years. This is the first I am hearing about mountain lions, probably because you are fortunate." He stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "Still, I would feel better if you carried a rifle. Are you worried about me, Dalton Cross?" "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. They stood beside the creek, water gurgling over smooth stones, and looked at each other. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I am no good at pretty words," he said. "My father was the orator in the family. But I need you to know that these past weeks, getting to know you, they have been the best I have had in 5 years. Dalton, you do not have to say anything. I just needed you to know." But she found she did want to say something. She took his hand, the one still hovering near her face, and pressed it flat against her palm. Their fingers interlaced. "My whole life," she said, "I have been pressing flowers in my Bible, trying to hold onto moments, preserve them. It never worked. They just died slower." She squeezed his hand. "I do not want to press flowers anymore. I want to live. I want to feel. I want this." He pulled her close and she went willingly. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, then deeper as questions became answers. She felt alive in a way she never had before, every nerve singing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he whispered. "I know. I am falling too." They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, listening to the creek and the evening birds. The sun sank toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Come to my ranch," Dalton said. "See where I live. Let me show you my world." "I would like that." They rode north the following Saturday, following old game trails into higher country. The landscape changed as they climbed, pine forests replacing grassland, the air growing thinner and cooler. After several hours, they crested a ridge and Dalton pointed. There. His ranch sat in a bowl-shaped valley, protected on 3 sides by mountains. A cabin stood near a clear stream with outbuildings and corrals arranged neatly around it. Cattle dotted the meadow, grazing peacefully. "It is beautiful," Theresa breathed. "It is home." The cabin was larger than her house, with real glass windows and a stone fireplace. Inside was neat and organized in a way that suggested a man who valued order. Books lined one wall, more books than she had ever seen outside a library. "My father's collection," Dalton said, seeing her look. "I could not bear to leave them behind." She ran her fingers along the spines. "Law books, yes, but also poetry, philosophy, novels." She pulled out a volume of Wordsworth and opened it to find handwritten notes in the margins. "He loved poetry," Dalton said softly. "Said it reminded him that law was meant to serve humanity, not replace it. I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you. He always said the measure of a person was what they did when the law failed them. You could have accepted Garrett's theft. Instead, you fought." Theresa replaced the book carefully. "I had help. You had courage. I just provided information." They spent the day exploring the ranch. Dalton showed her his cattle, pointed out landmarks, shared his plans for expanding the herd. She saw how much he loved this place, how it had healed him after his father's death. "Would you ever leave?" she asked as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset. "For the right reason, yes, but I would rather not have to." He looked at her. "What are you asking, Theresa?" "I suppose I am trying to understand what happens next, with us. What do you want to happen?" She thought about her small ranch, about the house she had shared with Thomas, about pressed flowers crumbling to dust. "I want to start fresh, something new, not built on old foundations." "You could sell your place, use the money to expand this ranch, build a larger house. One with room for a family." Her heart stuttered. "Is that a proposal?" "It is a statement of intent. The proposal comes later when I have worked up the courage." He took her hand. "But yes, Theresa, I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to grow old watching you pick wildflowers." Tears pricked her eyes. "You said you were no good with pretty words." "I lied." She laughed through the tears and kissed him. "Yes, my answer is yes." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Empire City. Marshall Briggs gave her away. Mrs. Hoffman baked the cake. Half the town came, partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of curiosity about the woman who had stood up to Richard Garrett. Garrett himself did not attend, but his absence felt like a presence, a reminder that the world held both joy and malice. Theresa chose not to let it shadow her day. She wore a new dress, cream-colored silk that Mrs. Hoffman helped her sew. Dalton wore a suit that had belonged to his father, carefully preserved, the only formal clothing he owned. When he saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes went bright with unshed tears. The ceremony was simple. They spoke traditional vows, promising to love and honor, for better or worse, in sickness and health. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The reception was held at Mrs. Hoffman's cafe. There was food and music and dancing. Theresa whirled in Dalton's arms, laughing, dizzy with happiness. At one point she caught sight of her reflection in a window and barely recognized herself. She looked radiant, alive. They spent their wedding night at the cabin. Dalton carried her over the threshold, an old tradition but one that made her giggle. Inside, candles glowed on every surface, casting warm light across the room. "When did you do this?" she asked. "This morning, before we left. I wanted it to be special." He was nervous, she realized. For all his confidence in other areas, this intimacy made him uncertain. She found it endearing. "Dalton," she said, taking his face in her hands, "I love you, just you. We will figure everything else out together." He kissed her deeply, and nervousness gave way to passion. They came together with the awkwardness of newness, but also profound tenderness. Afterward, lying in his arms, Theresa felt wholly content for the first time in years. "No regrets," Dalton murmured against her hair. "Not a single one." They fell asleep tangled together, and Theresa dreamed of wildflowers growing in impossible profusion, covering the mountains in color. The next weeks passed in a blur of domesticity and desire. Theresa sold her old ranch to a young couple from Kansas, farmers looking for a fresh start. The money was not much, but enough to contribute to expanding Dalton's operation. They hired a crew and spent August building a new house, larger than the old cabin, with a proper kitchen, and 2 bedrooms upstairs for the children they hoped to have. Theresa painted the kitchen yellow, bright as sunshine. Dalton built her shelves for her few possessions and a special table where she could arrange her wildflowers. "No more pressing them?" he asked, watching her arrange a bouquet of Indian paintbrush. "No more pressing. I want to enjoy them while they are alive." "Good philosophy." She turned from the flowers and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You know what you said that day by the creek, about pressing my hand in yours instead of pressing flowers. I remember. It was the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He kissed the top of her head. "It was true, still is. I would rather have you present and real and alive than any preserved memory." Life settled into comfortable rhythms. Theresa learned the cattle business, riding out with Dalton to check fences and move herds. She had a good eye for sick animals and a gentle hand with newborn calves. The 2 ranch hands, brothers named Jack and Tom, accepted her presence without question once they saw she was not afraid of hard work. They went to town every Saturday for supplies and to attend church on Sunday. Word of Theresa's confrontation with Garrett had spread, embroidered in the retelling until she hardly recognized the story. Some versions had her holding Garrett at gunpoint. Others claimed she had set fire to his office. "I did none of those things," she protested to Mrs. Hoffman. The older woman shrugged. "People like a good story, and they like seeing someone stand up to bullies. Let them have their legends." Garrett himself kept a low profile. Marshal Briggs reported that his lending practices had become somewhat more reasonable, though the man was still not to be trusted. Theresa spotted him once across the street, and their eyes met briefly. The hatred in his gaze made her shiver, but Dalton's hand at her back steadied her. "He cannot hurt you now," Dalton said quietly. "I know, but he wants to. Wanting and doing are different things." As summer turned to fall, the aspens on the mountainsides blazed gold. Theresa and Dalton took long rides through the changing landscape, marking the beauty of each day. She gathered fall flowers, asters and goldenrod, and brought them back to brighten the house. One evening in late September, as they sat by the fire after supper, Theresa put down her sewing and looked at her husband. He was reading one of his father's books, lamplight catching in his dark hair. "Dalton," he looked up. "Yes, I think I might be pregnant." He went very still. The book slid from his hands. "You think? I am fairly certain. I am 6 weeks late, and this morning I was sick." In 2 strides he was across the room, kneeling before her chair. "Truly?" She cupped his face, smiling. "Truly." He pressed his face against her stomach, and she felt his shoulders shake. When he looked up, tears streaked his cheeks. "I did not know I could be this happy," he said. "Me either." They held each other as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside. Another beginning. Another chance at life. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Theresa bloomed with health, her usual slenderness giving way to soft roundness. Dalton was absurdly protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work. She ignored him and continued her normal routines until she was too large to mount a horse comfortably. Winter came, heavy snows that isolated them for days at a time. Theresa did not mind. She sewed baby clothes and knitted small blankets while Dalton read aloud from his books. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their separate pasts, weaving those pasts into a shared history. "What do you hope for?" she asked one snowy evening. For the baby, Dalton considered, his hand resting on her swollen belly. "Health, happiness, the freedom to choose their own path. Not that they become a rancher like you, or a judge like your father. I want them to be themselves. Everything else is secondary." The baby, a boy, was born in March of 1879 during a late spring snowstorm. The labor was long and difficult. The midwife, brought from town days earlier in anticipation, worked with calm efficiency while Dalton paced downstairs, wearing a path in the new floorboards. When the baby's first cry split the air, he took the stairs 3 at a time. Theresa lay exhausted against the pillows, hair plastered to her forehead, but her smile was radiant. The midwife placed a small bundle in her arms. "You have a son," she said. Dalton sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his child. The baby had dark hair, a red scrunched face, tiny fists waving. Something shifted in Dalton's chest, some fundamental realignment of priorities and purpose. "He is perfect," he breathed. "He is loud," Theresa said, but her voice was full of wonder. They named him David after Dalton's father. David Cross, born into a world of mountains and possibilities. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, crowded with both mundane tasks and profound moments. David grew from infant to toddler to small boy, all curiosity and energy. He followed Dalton around the ranch on stumpy legs, chattering constantly, asking why about everything. When David was 3, Theresa gave birth to a daughter. Emma came easier than her brother had, arriving on a warm June morning as if eager to meet the world. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's smile. The house rang with children's laughter. Theresa hung their drawings on the kitchen walls. Dalton taught David to ride and read to Emma from the books his father had loved. They were, by any measure, happy. But happiness does not mean the absence of all trouble. The summer David turned 5, drought gripped the region. The usually reliable streams dwindled to trickles. The grass withered. Cattle grew thin. Dalton and his hands worked constantly, moving herds to whatever grazing remained, hauling water from the few springs that still flowed. Money grew tight. They cut back on everything they could. Other ranchers in the valley faced worse conditions. Some sold out, unable to weather the crisis. One evening in August, Dalton came in dusty and exhausted. He slumped at the kitchen table while Theresa set food before him. "How bad?" she asked quietly. The children were asleep upstairs. "Bad. We have lost 15 head. If we do not get rain soon, we will lose more. What are our options?" He rubbed his face. "We could sell some cattle, take the loss now, or we could hold on and hope the weather breaks." Theresa sat across from him. "What does your instinct say? Hold on. But instinct has been wrong before." She took his hands across the table. "Then we hold on together. We have savings. We have this house. We will manage." He squeezed her hands. "I should have provided better, protected you better. Dalton Cross, you listen to me. You have given me everything that matters. A life I chose, children I adore, love that sustains me. Whatever happens with the cattle, we have each other." His eyes shone. "How did I get so lucky? You offered me justice when no one else would, and you taught me to stop preserving dead things and start living." They weathered the drought. Rain finally came in September, too late to save that year's profits, but in time to green the pastures for fall grazing. They had to sell a portion of their herd and take loans to make it through winter, but they survived. The experience taught them both the fragility of their prosperity but also its foundation. The ranch mattered, the cattle mattered, but what they had built together mattered more. David started school in Empire City that fall. It meant a long ride twice a day, but Dalton insisted on education. "My father gave me books and learning," he said. "I will do the same for my children." Emma, at 2, missed her brother terribly. Theresa spent hours playing with her, taking her to pick wildflowers in the meadow, teaching her the names of birds and plants. "Mama, why do flowers die?" Emma asked one afternoon, holding a wilted columbine. Theresa knelt beside her. "Everything that lives must die eventually, sweetheart. That is what makes life precious. We appreciate it while we have it. Like David going to school, exactly like that. We miss him during the day, but that makes coming home even better." Emma considered this seriously, then nodded. "Okay." As the children grew, Theresa found herself thinking often about the woman she had been when she first met Dalton. That frightened widow, clinging to pressed flowers and fading memories. She barely recognized that person now. One day, while cleaning, she found her old Bible packed in a trunk. She opened it carefully. The pages still bore the faint marks where flowers had been pressed, ghostly stains and crumbled bits of petal. But the flowers themselves were long gone, released to the wind that night after Dalton first kissed her. She ran her fingers over the stains and smiled. Some ghosts were worth remembering, not as anchors to the past, but as markers of how far she had traveled. "What have you got there?" She turned to find Dalton in the doorway, David beside him. They had been working on reading lessons. "My old Bible. I was just thinking about how much has changed." David peered at the book curiously. "What are those marks?" "Places where I used to press flowers. A long time ago, before you were born." "Why did you stop?" Theresa glanced at Dalton, who smiled. "Because your father taught me something important. He said I should press my hand in his instead of pressing flowers in a book." David wrinkled his nose. "That does not make sense." Dalton laughed. "It means your mother learned to live in the present instead of trying to preserve the past." "Oh." David clearly did not understand but accepted the explanation. "Papa, can we finish the lesson? I want to read the part about the whale again." "Of course." They left, and Theresa closed the Bible gently. She would keep it, but not as a reliquary of dead things. Just as a book, useful and present, ready to be read and consulted as needed. The years continued their procession. David grew tall and serious, his father's son in temperament and build. Emma was all fire and laughter, fearless in a way that terrified and delighted her parents in equal measure. When David was 10 and Emma 7, Theresa gave birth to another son. They named him Thomas after her first husband. Dalton had suggested it. "He was part of your story," he said when she questioned the choice. "Without him, without everything that happened, we might never have found each other." That is worth honoring. Little Thomas was a sunny child, easy-going and affectionate. He brought a renewed energy to the household, a reminder that life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The ranch prospered. Good rains returned and stayed. Dalton expanded the herd, bought more land. They built a proper barn and hired more hands. The children had responsibilities appropriate to their ages, learning the value of work and contribution. Empire City grew and changed around them. The railroad finally came in 1882, bringing new people and opportunities. Some of the rough edges of frontier life smoothed away. The town got a proper school, a hospital, a library. Richard Garrett died in 1883. His obituary in the local paper praised his business acumen and civic contributions. No mention was made of his predatory lending or the families he had destroyed. Theresa read the obituary without satisfaction, but also without grief. He had been a hard man in hard times. She chose not to judge him further. Marshall Briggs retired and was replaced by a younger man from Denver. Mrs. Hoffman sold her cafe but remained in town, a beloved grandmother figure to half the population. Jack and Tom, the ranch hands, married sisters from a nearby ranch and built houses on Dalton's land, staying on as permanent employees and friends. Life was good. Not perfect, never perfect, but deeply good in ways that mattered. One summer evening when David was 15, Emma 12, and Thomas 5, the family sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The children were arguing amiably about something inconsequential. Theresa leaned against Dalton's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked quietly. "That day you agreed to help a stranger." "No, I imagined I would spend my life alone with my books and my cattle. I thought that was enough." He kissed her temple. "I was wrong. This is enough. You are enough. Our family, our life together, this is everything. No regrets, only that I did not find you sooner." She tilted her face up and he kissed her gently, the kiss of long familiarity and deep love. The children made exaggerated gagging sounds and they broke apart laughing. "You two are disgusting," Emma declared. "Just wait," Theresa told her. "Someday you will understand. Never, I am never falling in love. Boys are stupid." David threw a small pebble at his sister. "You are stupid." "Children," Dalton said mildly, but his eyes danced with amusement. The argument continued, escalating into a tickle fight that ended with all three children in a giggling heap. Theresa watched them with full heart. This was what she had been meant to find. Not preserved perfection, but messy, vital, beautiful life. That night, after the children were asleep, Theresa walked out to the meadow. The moon was full, bright enough to cast shadows. Wildflowers glowed in the silver light, columbines and asters and prairie roses. She picked a small bouquet, breathing in their green scent. Behind her, she heard Dalton's footsteps. "Could not sleep?" he asked. "Wanted to look at the flowers. They are especially beautiful tonight." He stood beside her, their shoulders touching. "Are you happy, Theresa?" She thought about the question seriously, looking at the flowers in her hand, at the mountains rising black against the star-scattered sky, at the man beside her whose hand she held. "Yes," she said simply. "I am happy." "Good, that is all I have ever wanted, your happiness." "You know what I have learned. Happiness is not a thing you find or achieve. It is a practice, a choice you make every day." Wise words. I had a good teacher. She set the flowers down gently on a flat rock. "Come on, let's go to bed." They walked back to the house hand in hand, their fingers interlaced. Behind them, the wildflowers swayed in the night breeze, alive and glorious and temporary. As all things are, as all things should be. The years that followed brought their share of sorrows and joys, as years do. David left for college in Denver when he was 18, studying law like his grandfather. Emma broke her arm falling from a horse and wore the scar like a badge of honor. Thomas developed a talent for drawing, filling sketchbooks with detailed studies of ranch life. Theresa's hair began to show threads of silver. Dalton's face creased with lines earned by years of sun and wind and laughter. They aged together, growing not apart but deeper into each other. When David finished law school, he returned to Empire City and hung out a shingle. His first case was defending a widow whose property was being seized by an unscrupulous lender. He won. His grandparents, Theresa thought, would have been proud. Emma, true to her childhood declaration, seemed uninterested in romance until she met a young veterinarian who came to treat a sick horse. She fell hard and fast, and her wedding was a joyous celebration that filled the church to capacity. Thomas stayed on the ranch, content with the life his parents had built. He was 20 when he told them he wanted to become a partner in the operation, not just an employee. "This is what I love," he said, gesturing at the mountains and meadows. "This place, this life, I want to help build it." Dalton clapped him on the shoulder, too moved to speak. Theresa kissed her youngest son's cheek. then that is what you will do. The ranch passed to a new generation, not as inheritance but as collaboration. Thomas brought fresh ideas and energy. The operation diversified, adding horses to the cattle, experimenting with new breeding techniques. Through it all, Theresa continued her practice of bringing wildflowers into the house. Fresh bouquets that she enjoyed for a few days, then composted and replaced. No pressing, no preservation, just appreciation for beauty in the moment. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dalton gave her a gift. It was a small wooden box beautifully made with her initials carved into the lid. "Open it," he urged. Inside were pressed flowers, dozens of them, carefully preserved between sheets of thin paper. Blue columbines, Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, all the flowers she had once pressed herself and then released. "I went out that night," he said softly. "After you let them go, I gathered as many as I could find and pressed them. I wanted to preserve that moment. Not because I wanted you to live in the past, but because I wanted to remember the night you chose the future, chose me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She touched the delicate petals, awed by the gesture. "Dalton, I have loved you for 20 years," he said. "Every day has been a gift. Every moment with you, the children, this life we built. I wanted to give you something that showed you I understood, that I saw you, that I have always seen you." She set the box down carefully and threw her arms around him. They stood in their kitchen, the same kitchen she had painted yellow 2 decades ago, and held each other. "I love you," she said against his chest. "I love you so much, I know, and I love you always." The years continued. They became grandparents when Emma had twin girls. David married a teacher from Denver, and they had a son. Thomas courted a rancher's daughter from the next valley and brought her home as his bride. The house that had once seemed so large filled again with the sounds of children. Grandchildren ran through the meadows, picking wildflowers just as their grandmother had. Theresa taught them the names of plants and birds. Dalton read to them from his father's books, another generation connected to the past through stories. They grew old together, Theresa and Dalton. Their hands became gnarled with arthritis. Their steps slowed, but they walked every evening they were able, following the creek, watching the light change on the mountains. "You remember the first time we walked here?" Theresa asked one evening. They were both 70 now, married for more than 30 years. Every detail. You wore a blue dress. Your hair was coming loose from its pins. You showed me where to find the best wildflowers. You told me about your father, about justice and law. I fell in love with you that day. I think I knew then that you would change everything." She leaned on his arm, grateful for his steadiness. "We changed each other. For the better. Definitely for the better." They stood by the creek as twilight deepened. Somewhere in the house behind them, their grandchildren were laughing. The sound carried on the evening air, bright and full of promise. "Theresa," Dalton said quietly, "I need you to know something." She heard the gravity in his voice and turned to look at him. "What is it? If I go first, and I probably will, you have to promise me you will keep living." "Really living. No pressing flowers in books, no freezing yourself in memory." Her throat tightened. "Dalton, promise me. You taught me how to live again. Do not forget your own lesson, I promise. But you have to promise me the same thing." "I do." They sealed it with a kiss. These two old people who loved each other more at 70 than they had at 30. In the event, they were fortunate. Neither went first by much. Theresa died on a bright October morning, the mountains ablaze with fall color. She simply did not wake up, passing peacefully in her sleep. Dalton followed 3 months later, his heart giving out as he sat by the fire reading. Their children found comfort in the symmetry of it. They had lived together, loved together, and left together, their separation only a brief pause before reunion. At the funeral, David spoke about his parents' legacy. Not just the ranch or the property, but the example they set. They taught us that love is a choice you make every day, he said. That happiness is not found in things, but in presence and attention and commitment to each other. Emma added her own thoughts. Mom used to tell us that life is like wildflowers, brief and beautiful and meant to be experienced, not preserved. She lived that philosophy every single day. Thomas, too emotional to speak much, simply said, "They loved each other, and they loved us. That is everything." They buried Theresa and Dalton side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains and meadows they had loved. The stone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line. They chose each other every day. On the graves, their children planted wildflowers, columbines and Indian paintbrush and prairie roses. Every spring they bloomed, a riot of color, brief and glorious and alive. The ranch continued, passed to Thomas and his children. The house remained in the family, sheltering new generations. David's law practice thrived, dedicated to justice for those who could not afford fancy lawyers. Emma became a midwife, bringing new life into the world just as her mother had brought her. The story of Theresa and Dalton became family legend, told and retold. How they met when she needed help. How he taught her to stop pressing flowers and start living. How they built a life together from almost nothing. How they loved each other fiercely and faithfully for more than 3 decades. And every summer, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren went into the meadow and picked wildflowers, filling the house with color and life. They arranged them in jars, enjoyed them for a few days, then picked fresh ones. No one pressed flowers in their Bibles anymore. That lesson had been learned. Life was meant to be lived, not preserved. Love was meant to be practiced, not displayed. Beauty was meant to be experienced in the moment, not frozen in time. These truths, learned by a young widow and a lonely rancher in the wild mountains of Colorado, echoed through generations. And on quiet evenings, when the light slanted golden across the meadows, those who knew the story swore they could see 2 figures walking hand in hand by the creek. Just ghosts, perhaps, of memory and love. Or perhaps something more. A reminder that what is built with love persists beyond the lives of the builders. That choosing each other, day after day, creates something that outlasts even death. The wildflowers still bloom in that meadow. Blue columbines and Indian paintbrush and prairie roses, painting the ground in colors that last only a season. Brief, temporary, perfect, just as life is meant to be, just as love always is. The mountains stand eternal, but it is the wildflowers, fragile and fleeting, that make them beautiful. And it is the people who love each other, with all their human frailty and mortality, who make life worth living. Theresa Vaughn Cross learned that lesson when she stopped pressing flowers in her Bible and pressed her hand into Dalton's instead. She lived it every day of her long and happy life. And the echo of that lesson, that truth, continues still in the meadow, in the mountains, in every wildflower that blooms and fades and returns again, in every hand that reaches out to clasp another, in every heart that chooses love over fear, presence over preservation, life over mere existence. That is the legacy. Not land or money or possessions, but the simple, profound truth that we are meant to live fully, love deeply, and let go gracefully when our time comes. The wildflowers know this. They have always known. And now, because of one woman who learned to stop pressing them in books, and one man who taught her that her living hand was more precious than any preserved petal, generations of humans know it too. The story ends as all good stories should, not with an ending, but with a continuation. Life goes on. Love persists, and somewhere in the Colorado mountains, Wildflowers bloom in a meadow, brief and beautiful and exactly as they should be.